Hey guys, today we're diving deep into something that might seem a little unexpected: early weapons. Imagine you're one of the first humans, living in a world where survival is key, where the daily struggle to find food, shelter, and warmth is a matter of life and death. Now, picture yourself walking through the wild, clutching a spear or a stone tool, this thing you've carefully crafted, a weapon designed for hunting and self-defense. But here's the twist: the real purpose of your weapon isn't necessarily survival. It's about showing off. You probably won't survive this if you think weapons were purely practical at first. They were more than just tools, they were fashion statements. Early humans didn't just want a tool that worked. They wanted one that stood out, that said something about who they were in the tribe. And as much as a weapon can be a tool of war, it can also be a symbol of status, strength, and identity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Early weapons, whether a crafted spear, a finely chipped stone, or a beautifully decorated club, weren't just about functionality. They were about showing others where you stood in the pecking order. Early humans were crafting more than just tools. They were making statements. Let's dig into why the first weapons were, in a lot of ways, more about fashion than function. After all, no one ever really died because they had a weapon that was a little too shiny or too elaborate, but they certainly had a reason to show it off. When early humans first began to craft weapons, it wasn't just about utility, it was about identity. Sure, a sharp, well-made stone tool or a spear might have been vital for hunting and self-defense, but these weapons weren't just made for function. They were made to be seen, to impress, and to display social status. Think about it. Early humans didn't live in a world where everyone was fighting for their lives every single day. Yes, danger was always lurking: wild animals, rival tribes, and the constant threat of starvation. But the truly dangerous moments, the life or death struggles, were relatively rare. In between those moments, humans were more focused on how they presented themselves to their tribe. Historians still argue whether the initial purpose of weapon making was driven more by aesthetics or pure survival. Some scholars believe that early humans crafted weapons purely for practicality. Function always came first. But there's another school of thought that suggests early humans were creating something far more symbolic than just tools. These weapons were status symbols, showing off craftsmanship, strength, and skill. The more decorated a spear or axe was, the more it said about the person wielding it. It wasn't just about being the strongest or most capable hunter. It was about being someone who stood out in the tribe, someone worthy of respect. You might be thinking, how could early humans, living in such harsh conditions, have time to care about how their weapons looked? Well, it turns out that the same ingenuity that led humans to craft efficient tools also led them to add flair and design. In fact, some of the oldest tools and weapons we've found have intricate carvings, added decorations, and even symbolic shapes. These weren't just made to survive, they were made to be shown off, carried, and admired. The concept of fashion in this context may seem strange, but it was deeply ingrained in early human life. In a world where every day was a struggle for survival, standing out from the crowd was a way of gaining respect and elevating one's social standing. Early humans were keenly aware of their place in the hierarchy of their group, and their weapons were a way of visually signaling their importance. A finely crafted weapon, especially one that demonstrated skill or had unique decorations, would have made its owner stand out as a leader, a hunter, or a figure of power. These weapons didn't just say, "I can protect myself," they said, "I am someone to be reckoned with." Imagine a spear, simple in design, yet carved with intricate patterns, the handle smoothed to perfection. You wouldn't just use it to hunt, you would carry it with pride. It wasn't just your survival tool, it was your badge of identity. This idea of weapons as a visual display of status could also explain why early humans took such care in their design, making sure that their tools were not only functional, but also beautiful in their own right. The desire to impress, to stand out, and to convey status was deeply embedded in early human societies. It wasn't enough to simply survive. You had to survive in style. Whether for ceremonial purposes, hunting, or social competition, early humans used their weapons to make a statement about who they were, and the more ornate or meticulously crafted a weapon was, the more it signified respect and social importance within the group. Now, let's take a closer look at how these early weapons functioned as social tools. In early human societies, survival was a collective effort. But even in such tight-knit groups, there had to be a way to distinguish the leaders, the skilled hunters, and those who had earned respect. And what better way to do this than through the weapons you carried? A beautifully crafted weapon was more than just a tool. It was an extension of your identity, a way to signal your place in the tribe. Historians still debate the precise role of weapons in early human social structure. Some suggest that weapons like spears or axes were shared tools used for communal hunting, with no particular emphasis on individual ownership. Others argue that weapons were deeply personal, marking the owner's role within the group and indicating their level of experience, skill, or status. For instance, a spearhead that was carefully shaped, decorated, and engraved would likely have been the mark of a skilled craftsman or a respected hunter. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a social badge, worn with pride. The significance of these weapons as social tools is further illustrated by the way early humans treated them. As human society became more complex, weapons may have evolved from purely utilitarian objects to symbols of power and prestige. Consider the role of ceremonial weapons, those tools that, while they may have seen little practical use, were designed for display. These weapons, often ornate and meticulously crafted, were probably used in rituals or ceremonies, adding layers of meaning to what were otherwise mundane survival tools. Weapons like these would have been passed down through generations, becoming heirlooms that carried the history and the prestige of the family or tribe. But it wasn't just the elite who used weapons for social signaling. Even the most basic tools were designed with attention to form and beauty, reflecting the early human desire to convey something about themselves to the group. A simple stone tool, shaped with care and polished, spoke to the wielder's skill and effort, and it likely carried some symbolic weight within the group. It wasn't just about being able to cut through meat or defend yourself from an attacker. It was about how well you could craft that tool, how much effort you put into its creation, and how that tool reflected your personal worth. These early weapons also played a critical role in defining relationships within the group. When you gifted a finely made weapon to another, it wasn't just a gesture of goodwill. It was a way of establishing trust, friendship, or allegiance. In some ways, weapons became currency, a form of exchange that carried both practical and social value. Sharing a weapon or using one in a communal hunt likely strengthened bonds between individuals, solidifying relationships that were crucial for survival. Now, let's talk about the material culture that surrounded early weapons. Early humans, when crafting their tools, weren't just thinking about efficiency, they were considering how their work would be seen by others. For example, many early weapons were crafted from bone, wood, and stone, materials that were readily available, yet required considerable skill to shape. A finely crafted spear or knife made from bone or flint wasn't just a tool, it was a masterpiece in itself. The process of creating these objects required not just practical knowledge, but artistic flair. In this way, early weapons were as much about self-expression and cultural identity as they were about practical survival. As the Ice Age transitioned into a warmer world, with new creatures and new environments, the role of these weapons evolved, too. Early humans, as they became more sedentary and settled into communities, started to use weapons not just for hunting, but for defense against other tribes, wild animals, or even during ritualistic practices. As the need for physical confrontation and aggression grew, so did the symbolism of the weapon. A simple spear became a way to define who you were, how you were perceived by your tribe, and how you asserted your place in the broader human society. In essence, the role of early weapons was as much about the why as the how. Yes, they served a practical function, but they also served as markers of personal and social identity. These weapons weren't just tools, they were the embodiment of status, strength, and culture. The distinction between functionality and fashion may seem strange, but it was essential to the way early humans understood their world. As they crafted and carried their weapons, they were creating not just tools for survival, but symbols of who they were in relation to each other. The crafting of early weapons wasn't solely about hunting or defense. It was also about creativity and self-expression. Early humans spent hours, even days, shaping and refining their tools, often paying careful attention to their design. This attention to detail wasn't driven purely by necessity, but by an innate desire to create something that was both functional and beautiful. In a world where survival was the priority, making tools that stood out, that were aesthetically pleasing, was a remarkable and somewhat counterintuitive decision. Yet it was one that early humans embraced. Consider the intricacy of some of the earliest stone tools. They weren't just rough, functional instruments. They were often precisely flaked to create sharp edges, with a certain symmetry that might have seemed purely decorative. This attention to form over function can be seen in the way early humans decorated their weapons. Spears, knives, and axes weren't just made to kill animals. They were crafted with care, often adorned with engravings, bone or antler handles, and sometimes even colored pigments or beads. This wasn't necessary for survival, but it was important for communication within the tribe. Historians still debate the role of decoration in early weapons. Some believe that the ornamental features were purely symbolic, perhaps used to communicate the weapon's ownership, status, or the warrior's achievements. Others suggest that the decoration was a way to add a deeper spiritual or cultural meaning to the tools. Either way, these decorative elements played a key role in how weapons were perceived and valued in the social fabric of early communities. The first weapons were as much about the who as they were about the how. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer artistry behind these creations. Early humans didn't just select the sharpest rock or the toughest bone to make their weapons. They selected materials that were also visually striking. For example, bone handles and antler inlays weren't just durable. They were beautiful, reflecting the artist's hand in the design. The added flourishes might have been seen as a symbol of skill, and in some cultures, owning a beautifully crafted weapon could even indicate a high social standing. Your spear wasn't just your tool for survival, it was also a statement about your identity and place within the tribe. And, of course, the artistry wasn't just about decoration. Functionality was still key. Early humans understood that a weapon needed to work. But it's clear that, over time, function and form started to merge. Take, for example, the shift from purely functional tools to those that also incorporated symbols or designs that made them more impressive. The weapons weren't just tools of war. They were a medium for self-expression, a way to show your skill, and a way to signify your role within the tribe. The more refined the weapon, the more respect it commanded. Perhaps, in the most primal sense, the crafting of these weapons was also a way for early humans to leave a lasting mark on the world. While they might not have had the technology to carve their names into a monument, their weapons became an imprint of their legacy. The ornate designs on their spears or the finely crafted edges of their stone knives told a story of skill, of strength, and of the desire to create something that outlived the moment. Weapons also served as symbols of identity beyond the personal level. The way a weapon was made and decorated might signal the wearer's role in the group. Was it a warrior spear, or perhaps a tool used in a religious ceremony? The style and complexity of the weapon might reflect not just the owner's skill, but their social role or their accomplishments. The more decorated a weapon was, the more it could represent the owner's status or role in the tribe. It became a mark of social hierarchy, where the elaborately crafted weapons likely belonged to those with more authority, skill, or prestige. This is where the duality of fashion and function comes into play. The need to survive in an ever-changing world certainly pushed early humans to develop functional, practical weapons. But those same weapons, as time passed, became far more than just utilitarian objects. They were tools for social signaling, objects of beauty, and symbols of the human desire to leave a mark on the world. They spoke of culture, identity, and even of the first inklings of a more organized society. The simple tools of survival were being transformed into something greater, something that spoke to the aspirations, creativity, and unity of early humans. Early weapons weren't just about protecting life, they were about defining it, marking a place in history, and shaping the future. And in that process, they became as much a reflection of who we were as what we needed to survive. As early humans began to refine their weapons, blending both function and form, something else began to emerge. These weapons became objects of ritual and ceremony. They weren't just tools of survival or social standing. They were part of the spiritual and ceremonial life of the tribe. In many early cultures, weapons played a key role in rituals, whether in hunting, war, or sacred ceremonies. They were no longer just tools for killing. They were symbols of power, protection, and connection to the spiritual world. Historians still argue whether the earliest weapons were initially crafted for ceremonial purposes before they were adopted for practical use, or whether their ceremonial significance developed after their functional use. Some suggest that these objects were primarily designed for rituals, blessing the hunt, honoring the gods, or offering protection. It's possible that early humans were so deeply connected to their environment and the forces of nature that they imbued their weapons with spiritual significance. A weapon, carefully carved and adorned, could represent not just physical power, but a connection to the divine or to the ancestors. Imagine the process: a group of hunters preparing for a dangerous hunt, each person outfitting their spear with decorations, charms, or marks of personal meaning. Perhaps they adorned their tools with images of the animals they hoped to capture, or symbols of strength, protection, and victory. These decorated weapons weren't just meant to kill. They were tools to invoke power, to connect with nature, and to ensure a successful hunt. The act of preparing the weapon, of adding personal touches, was as much about spiritual preparation as it was about practical survival. Weapons in early rituals didn't just mark personal achievement, they marked communal identity. A warrior's weapon wasn't just his own, it was a representation of the tribe. It told stories of past battles, victories, and sacrifices. Whether it was a finely crafted axe with intricate etchings or a spear with feathers tied to the end, each weapon was a cultural artifact, a reflection of the group's collective beliefs, values, and traditions. The weapon, once a tool for hunting or defense, became a key element in the tribe's spiritual and social structure. This intertwining of weaponry and ritual continued in many societies throughout history. Even in early societies where weaponry was essential for survival, the ceremonial role of weapons was just as important. From the decorated spears of ancient tribes to the swords and shields of warriors in later civilizations, weapons were often used in ceremonies that celebrated the tribe's strength and identity. They were not just tools, they were the very essence of the tribe's spirit and its connection to the world. Consider the role of the weapon in initiation ceremonies. In some cultures, young warriors were given their first weapon as part of a rite of passage. This was no ordinary tool. It was a symbol of their transition from boy to man, from novice to skilled warrior. The weapon they received wasn't just a tool for fighting. It was a reminder of their responsibilities to the tribe, to their ancestors, and to the spirits of the land. It was a link between generations and a mark of personal and communal honor. In these rituals, weapons weren't simply weapons. They became symbols of protection, power, and respect. The spiritual weight attached to them made them much more than just survival tools. They were the embodiment of the tribe's values, the promises made to ancestors and gods, and the hopes for the future. They were cherished, passed down through generations, and in some cases, even buried with the deceased to accompany them into the afterlife. As early humans began to understand their relationship with the world, their weapons became a vital part of their survival strategy, not just as functional tools, but as keys to securing their place in the world. These weapons were not just about defense or offense. They were the very lifeblood of the community, representing the bond between the physical and the spiritual, between survival and identity. As early humans crafted their weapons with such intricate care and spiritual significance, the tools they created began to have a lasting impact on the very fabric of society. These weapons, while primarily designed for survival, also became objects of social distinction and cultural continuity. Each weapon, with its carefully crafted design, not only communicated the skill of its maker, but also spoke to the identity of the group. Early humans began to realize that what they carried had meaning beyond its function. It was a marker of status, belonging, and power. The social implications of these weapons became clearer as societies began to organize. In smaller, more egalitarian groups, weapons may have been shared among all members, reflecting the cooperative nature of the group. However, as these groups grew and became more complex, weapons began to symbolize more than just the ability to survive. They became indicators of an individual's position within the social hierarchy. A finely crafted weapon could signal that its owner had a certain level of expertise, respect, or leadership within the group. Historians still debate the timeline of how social hierarchies developed and when weapons began to be used as indicators of status. Some believe that the increasing need for protection and competition within expanding communities led to the rise of hierarchical systems, with individuals who owned the most well-crafted weapons gaining more influence. Others suggest that weapons were still considered communal tools early on, and that individual status only became tied to personal weaponry as human societies became more sedentary and specialized. Whatever the case, by the time early humans began to settle in more permanent villages and towns, the role of weapons as a symbol of status had become firmly established. Those who could craft the most effective and beautifully designed weapons likely garnered the most respect in their communities. These individuals, often seen as warriors or skilled craftsmen, played a vital role in ensuring the survival of the group. Their weapons became a direct reflection of their contributions to the tribe, whether they were leaders in battle, skilled hunters, or protectors of the community. In some early human societies, the weapon could even represent personal achievement. The more elaborate the weapon, the more it likely reflected the experience and accomplishments of its owner. A warrior who had survived countless battles or led successful hunts might have crafted or been given a weapon of exceptional quality, marking their success and reputation. The weapon itself became an artifact of honor, a tool that was both a means of survival and a reflection of the individual's identity within the tribe. But weapons weren't just about personal status. They were also an expression of cultural values. As early human societies grew, they began to use weapons as symbols of their collective strength and unity. The design and decoration of weapons often reflected the values and beliefs of the group, whether it was honoring the gods, showing respect for the natural world, or representing the tribe's history and traditions. These weapons weren't just tools for survival. They were the embodiment of the community's identity and ideals. Moreover, the use of weapons as social symbols didn't just stop at everyday survival. They began to play an increasingly important role in rituals, ceremonies, and trade. In some cases, weapons were used in rites of passage, marking the transition from adolescence to adulthood or the initiation of a new leader within the tribe. The weapon, as both an item of function and a symbol of honor, was passed down from one generation to the next, solidifying the continuity of the tribe's culture and values. This process of weapon crafting and the cultural importance placed on these tools laid the groundwork for the emergence of more formalized leadership systems and complex societies. As the importance of weapons as status symbols grew, so did the need for organized trade, communication, and eventually governance. The creation of weapons, once a purely survival-driven task, began to merge with the social fabric of early human life, leading to the development of the complex social systems we see in more advanced societies later in history. By the time humanity moved from small, wandering tribes to larger, more structured communities, weapons were no longer simply survival tools. They had become powerful symbols of personal achievement, group identity, and social status. The fashion of early weapons was no longer just about showing off a functional tool. It was about showing off who you were, where you stood, and what you represented within your community. As early humans began to craft weapons with greater detail and purpose, the tools they created began to serve another important function beyond status and survival. They became cultural artifacts. These weapons, which were once simple tools for hunting and protection, evolved into objects of symbolic power. Early humans didn't just use weapons for their intended purposes. They began to use them to tell stories, communicate cultural values, and define their identity within the tribe. Consider the role of weapons in early rituals. These tools were no longer just part of everyday life. They were intricately woven into the spiritual practices of the tribe. A spear or a club, well designed and decorated, might have been used in ceremonies meant to honor the gods, ensure a successful hunt, or celebrate victories. Weapons, in this sense, transcended their function as tools. They became conduits for spiritual energy, imbuing their owners with protection and strength. In some cultures, weapons were also used in initiation rites, marking the transition from boy to man or from warrior to leader. Historians still debate the exact spiritual role of weapons in early human societies. Some argue that they were purely practical objects, used to signify the warrior's role or his social status. Others suggest that weapons were seen as vessels of divine power, given to those deemed worthy by the tribe or the gods. What is certain is that these early weapons were not just crafted and used, they were cherished and passed down, often carrying deep personal and spiritual significance. As early humans began to understand the power of these objects, the weapons themselves became imbued with a cultural weight. The design of the weapon mattered, but so did the way it was used in ritual or ceremony. A weapon might be passed down from generation to generation, not just as a tool, but as a symbol of family, honor, and tradition. The bearer of the weapon was seen not just as a protector or hunter, but as someone who carried with them the legacy and spirit of their ancestors. In some societies, the act of creating a weapon was seen as an almost sacred task. The tools used for crafting weapons, whether they were stone, bone, or later metal, were treated with reverence. The artisans who created weapons were skilled and respected, and their work often reflected a deep understanding of both form and function. The ceremonial importance of weapon-making meant that weapons became a bridge between the mundane and the divine, between survival and spirituality. They were no longer just tools. They were a way of connecting with the past, ensuring protection for the present, and securing prosperity for the future. This use of weapons in ceremonial contexts also had a social function. As weapons became more than just tools for survival, they began to play an increasing role in establishing one's place in the community. Leaders and warriors, for instance, often possessed specially crafted, highly decorative weapons that symbolized their authority, courage, and connection to the tribe's spiritual beliefs. A leader's weapon wasn't just for battle, it was a statement of their role within the tribe. It represented the strength and protection they offered, but it also marked their responsibility to their people. Weapons, in this context, were more than just survival gear. They were status markers, connecting the individual to the collective, and they were intertwined with the tribe's very survival. The more elaborate the weapon, the higher the status it conveyed. And as these weapons were passed down or traded, they also became symbols of the tribe's cultural continuity. The sword or spear wasn't just about power, it was about keeping traditions alive and ensuring that the stories and values of the tribe would survive. This brings us to the idea of the weapon as a form of cultural currency. Early humans didn't just trade tools, they traded symbols of power, legacy, and identity. A finely crafted weapon could be exchanged in trade or given as a gift to mark an important alliance or relationship. In this way, weapons became a bridge between individuals, communities, and even larger tribes. They were not only practical, they were integral to building and maintaining the social fabric of early human societies. As time went on and societies grew more complex, the symbolic power of weapons continued to evolve. By the time humans began to establish more permanent settlements, the role of weapons had expanded to include more than just defense. They were part of the culture itself, woven into art, rituals, leadership, and social organization. Even as tools became more refined and specialized, they never lost their cultural significance. These early weapons, fashioned with care and purpose, left a lasting legacy. Not only did they help humans survive the harsh environments they faced, but they also became the foundation for future societies and their understanding of identity, power, and legacy. From being simple hunting tools to becoming symbols of status, ritual, and leadership, early weapons were a reflection of the ingenuity and creativity of early humans. They were about more than just fashion. They were the tools that shaped the very fabric of social life. As early humans transitioned from purely survival-driven communities to more complex social structures, the symbolic and ceremonial importance of weapons became even more pronounced. In this increasingly organized society, weapons evolved from being just tools for hunting or defense into essential markers of leadership, identity, and culture. The weapons of early humans became emblematic of their roles within their communities, showing off not just physical prowess, but their connection to spiritual and cultural ideals that were growing in importance. The ritualistic aspect of weapons began to play a central role in the tribe's social and spiritual life. The practice of presenting or gifting a weapon was often tied to crucial moments in an individual's life, such as rites of passage, achievements, or ascension into leadership. Take the example of a young warrior receiving his first spear or axe. This wasn't just an acquisition of a tool, it was a symbolic entry into adulthood, a mark of respect from the tribe, and a demonstration that the young person was now part of something larger than themselves. It was an honor, a responsibility, and a connection to the ancestors, all wrapped into one. Historians still debate the extent to which these weapons were primarily ceremonial in early human societies. While it's clear that they were essential for hunting and warfare, some scholars suggest that, particularly as these groups became more sedentary, weapons were just as much about status and identity. There's evidence of weapons being used in feasts, dances, and other social gatherings, signaling that they were not always used for their practical purposes. Instead, they became a part of social rituals and community bonding, reinforcing ties within the group and strengthening the tribe's collective identity. In addition to these ceremonial uses, weapons were also used as a form of storytelling. The markings, engravings, or embellishments on the weapon could tell the history of its owner, marking victories, important battles, or significant life events. A decorated spear or a beautifully carved club might carry images or symbols that reflected personal achievements or tribe-wide accomplishments. In a world without written language, these weapons could have been some of the most important ways of recording and passing on history, allowing one generation to tell the stories of another through the objects they crafted and carried. Furthermore, as early humans began to settle into more permanent villages and establish more complex societal structures, the weapons became more specialized, further elevating their importance as cultural symbols. A warrior's weapon, especially those with intricate designs or personalized decorations, was not just functional. It was a representation of the warrior's power, their authority within the tribe, and their connection to the spiritual realm. These weapons were used in rituals not only for hunting or defense, but also for communal ceremonies that marked important events in the tribe's life. Weapons as a cultural currency became more common as trade between groups grew. Early humans didn't just trade food or resources, they traded their symbols of power. A finely crafted spear or an ornate knife might be exchanged as part of a peace treaty, a sign of respect or alliance between different tribes. This practice demonstrated that weapons were not only important for physical survival, they had an increasing role in the social and diplomatic exchanges that became integral to human societies. As these weapons passed from hand to hand, they carried with them more than just their material value. They carried the legacy of the individual and the tribe. The way a weapon was crafted, decorated, and passed down through generations was a way to preserve and honor the community's history. In some ways, these weapons became vessels of cultural memory, carrying the weight of both the present and the past, the practical and the ceremonial, all at once. Weapons, in this sense, became symbols of continuity. As early humans transitioned from nomadic lifestyles to more permanent settlements, these weapons were the links between the old ways and the new. They represented survival and strength, but also the traditions that held the community together. The continued use of weapons for ceremonial purposes, alongside their practical roles in hunting and defense, helped early humans maintain their connection to their past while adapting to the changing world around them. As the use of weapons in early human societies evolved, so did the meaning attached to them. They transitioned from simple survival tools into multifaceted objects, deeply woven into the social, spiritual, and cultural fabric of early human life. However, as the tools became more advanced and specialized, the distinction between practicality and fashion grew clearer. What began as purely utilitarian, focused on providing food and defending the tribe, gradually shifted into more ornamental and symbolic forms, often reflecting the tribe's changing values and desires. The progression of weapon design itself reflects this evolution. As early humans mastered stone tools and weapons, they began to incorporate not just functionality, but artistry into their creations. It was no longer enough for a spear to simply be sharp. It needed to be finely crafted, decorated, and visually striking. A weapon with elaborate carvings or carefully chosen materials, bone handles, antler inlays, intricate patterns etched into the blade, was a weapon that told a story. It spoke of the skill of its creator, the prestige of its owner, and the culture it represented. Historians still argue over the balance between utility and decoration in early weapons. Some believe that practical utility always took precedence and that the aesthetic elements of weapons were secondary. Others suggest that the rise of ornamentation signified an increasing importance of the weapon as a status symbol rather than just a tool. Regardless of the exact balance, it's clear that early humans began to invest in their weapons in ways that went beyond the need for survival. These weapons, adorned with personal touches, were becoming the first expressions of individual identity and collective culture. The growing emphasis on decoration, status, and symbolism was reflective of the greater societal changes taking place at the time. As early human societies moved from nomadic to more sedentary lifestyles, social hierarchies began to form. No longer was survival a matter of simply hunting and gathering together. Now, leadership, power, and prestige began to play an increasing role. Weapons became symbols of these growing social structures. Leaders, warriors, and skilled hunters who had access to the best-made weapons were often seen as the most powerful individuals in the group. But weapons were not just personal expressions, they were also communal representations of group identity. Early humans used weapons to signal unity or display allegiance to a particular tribe or leader. When weapons were exchanged between groups, they were often gifts that cemented relationships or made political statements. The trading of finely crafted weapons could signify peace, alliance, or mutual respect, much like modern diplomats exchanging gifts today. The weapon, in this sense, transcended its practical use and became a form of cultural diplomacy, helping to maintain and strengthen relationships between tribes. In some cases, the ritual of giving a weapon was a profound way of expressing commitment, loyalty, and shared belief. These ceremonial weapons, highly decorated and carefully crafted, carried with them not just the skill of the maker, but the values and beliefs of the community. When a young warrior received his first weapon, it wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of the tribe's faith in his ability to contribute to the group's survival. Similarly, when a leader passed down a weapon, it was not only a transfer of power, but a confirmation of the values the tribe held dear. The role of weapons as status symbols wasn't just confined to the elite, either. As weapons became more intricate and widespread, the notion of fashion seeped into every layer of society. A well-carved weapon, even for the average hunter or gatherer, became a point of pride. Just as clothes or ornaments are used in modern society to express personality or rank, early humans used their weapons as personal statements. This was especially true in the realm of ritual. Many early human tribes used weapons in dances, feasts, and other ceremonial events. The weapons were often paraded around, not just for their function, but for their display of craftsmanship and the cultural significance they carried. Interestingly, the evolution of weapon fashion mirrors the broader development of art and material culture. As humans began to settle into more permanent communities, the boundaries between function and aesthetic blurred. Just as humans started to adorn their bodies with jewelry, tattoos, or intricate clothing, they began to see their tools and weapons not only as items to be used, but as expressions of culture, belief, and identity. Weapons became part of the artistry of life. Each engraved line or polished surface spoke not just to the tool's effectiveness, but to its beauty, purpose, and the culture from which it came. By the time these early humans had begun to shape more complex societies, weapons were no longer just items of utility. They had evolved into cultural objects, symbols of strength, power, and belief, woven into the very identity of the tribe. They weren't simply crafted to survive. They were crafted to express something much deeper about the person carrying them and the community from which they came. Weapons like art became a tool not just for survival, but for thriving within a social, spiritual, and cultural framework. As weaponry evolved from tools of survival to powerful symbols of identity, the way early humans viewed their place in society became increasingly complex. The connection between personal status, cultural value, and physical power became more tightly intertwined. By now, weapons had transcended their initial role as simple tools for hunting or defense. They were reflections of an individual's place within the tribe, a testament to their skill, their strength, and their cultural significance. Early humans didn't just need tools for survival, they needed ways to define themselves in a constantly shifting world. Whether they were finely crafted spears, intricately decorated knives, or ornate axes, the weapons they used and carried became as much about self-expression as they were about utility. In a society where survival was a daily struggle, a beautifully crafted weapon could signal that you weren't just surviving, you were thriving. It could express your status, your value, and your worth within the group. Historians still debate the extent to which early humans saw their weapons as status symbols versus functional tools. While some argue that functionality was always paramount, others suggest that, over time, as societies grew more complex and hierarchical, the display of wealth, power, and artistry became more important. It's likely that early humans started to balance function with form, creating tools that were just as much about showing off personal craftsmanship and social prestige as they were about hunting or self-defense. As we look at the way early humans adorned their weapons, it's clear that they took great pride in the aesthetics of their tools. Whether it was through intricate carvings, beads, feathers, or inlays, the decoration of weapons revealed how these early people valued beauty, artistry, and personal expression. A well-made weapon, decorated with skill and attention to detail, told the world, "This is mine, and it reflects who I am." It wasn't just about what the weapon could do, it was about what it represented. This desire to adorn weapons with such care and detail highlights how weaponry became an extension of one's identity. Just as modern people might wear jewelry or designer clothes to communicate personal style or status, early humans used their weapons to make a similar statement. Whether the weapon was crafted from bone, stone, or antler, it became a personal statement about the owner's skill, place in the tribe, and respect for the traditions that connected them to the world around them. But beyond personal identity, weapons also played a crucial role in marking the boundaries of social power within the tribe. Certain individuals, particularly leaders and warriors, began to be associated with more elaborate and impressive weapons. These were often seen as symbols of their authority and their connection to the tribe's survival. The weapon of a leader or warrior became a tangible representation of their ability to protect and provide for the group. The more elaborate and finely crafted the weapon, the greater the social status it signified. For early humans, this wasn't just about holding power, it was about showing power, demonstrating that you were capable of leading, protecting, and guiding your people. This connection between weaponry and social power didn't just remain within the tribe, it extended to interactions between groups. The exchange of weapons could signify alliances or rivalries, marking the ebb and flow of power between communities. In some cases, gifting a finely crafted weapon to another tribe could cement a relationship of peace, or it could be a sign of dominance and authority. The more beautiful and powerful the weapon, the greater the message it conveyed. The rise of more complex societies brought with it a more formalized system of trade and diplomacy, and weapons became part of this exchange. Whether it was a spear, an axe, or a dagger, these items were not just tools, they were investments, cultural artifacts that told the story of the group's craftsmanship, strength, and values. As the exchange of goods became more widespread, the power of weaponry as a social tool expanded. Weapons began to play an integral role in maintaining social order, marking the relationships between tribes and individuals and ensuring that the community's legacy endured. As early humans advanced and their communities grew larger and more complex, the role of weaponry evolved again. No longer were these tools just symbols of power within the tribe, they became part of the larger social and cultural landscape of humanity. The development of more advanced technologies, such as metallurgy and the rise of weaponry in the formation of military forces, would continue to shift the role of weapons from personal and tribal symbols of strength to tools of empire and global power. But no matter how much weaponry evolved, its cultural significance remained. Early weapons were more than just tools. They were the threads that wove the social fabric of early human societies, the physical markers of identity, status, and power. The way these weapons were crafted, decorated, and passed down told the story of a people's creativity, values, and connection to the natural world. Weapons were never just about survival. They were always about defining who you were and how you fit into the larger story of your tribe, your culture, and your world. As early humans moved further into the development of organized societies, the role of weapons continued to shift, but one thing remained constant. Weapons were a vital part of personal and communal identity. The transformation of weapons from purely functional tools to cultural symbols of power, status, and spiritual connection shows just how much early human life was influenced by the objects they created. But what happened after the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to more complex, sedentary agricultural communities? As tribes grew into villages and villages into early cities, the role of weapons evolved once again. They were no longer just about status within a small community. Now, they were part of a larger political system. Early weapons, especially as people began to master metalworking, were symbols of not only personal power, but political and military might. The weapon, once a personal item, something crafted to show individual skill, became a tool of governance, control, and conquest. Interestingly, as weapons became more specialized, so did the social implications. The earliest spear or flint knife, which could be made by anyone in the tribe, gave way to more refined tools like bronze or iron swords, which required specialized knowledge to craft. These new weapons were the domain of a few skilled artisans or warriors, and as such, their value skyrocketed. What was once an everyday object, a mere necessity for survival, became the sign of an elite class. Those who could afford or create these specialized weapons were given authority, not just as hunters or defenders, but as leaders, warriors, and rulers. The social function of weapons shifted alongside these technological advances. They became symbols of wealth, prestige, and authority. The decorative elements that had once been about showing off personal craftsmanship now took on even greater meaning. A finely crafted sword or an intricately decorated axe became an emblem of one's political power. They weren't just tools, they were the physical representations of authority, protection, and leadership. Leaders who wielded such weapons weren't just physically equipped to protect their people, they were spiritually and culturally aligned with the powers they represented. This shift towards weaponry as a symbol of political power meant that the design and quality of a weapon became a critical part of social identity. A warrior's sword or a leader's spear could determine their standing in society, making these objects not only tools of war, but also critical pieces of cultural capital. The beauty and craftsmanship of a weapon became almost as important as its utility, with intricate designs signifying the wealth and influence of its owner. Weapons became important not only for the protection of a tribe or community, but for the establishment and maintenance of control over larger territories. With the rise of agriculture and sedentary life came the growth of cities, which were more vulnerable to attack than the nomadic camps of the past. The invention of fortified structures, such as walls and watchtowers, required a corresponding evolution in military strategy. A single well-crafted weapon, whether it was a sword, spear, or bow, could symbolize the military might of a group and serve as a visual deterrent to potential enemies. Weapons weren't just tools of war anymore. They were instruments of diplomacy and defense in a world that was growing more interconnected. Even as early humans started to move away from purely survival-based weaponry, they still maintained a deep respect for the traditional tools of their ancestors. The symbolism of weapons, with their intricate decorations and spiritual significance, continued to permeate early societies. These tools were passed down through generations, each new owner inheriting not just a weapon, but the cultural and spiritual legacy of their forebears. The importance of a weapon was not just in its ability to fight, it was in what it represented. Every weapon was a link to the past, a connection to the ancestors who had crafted it, and a symbol of the community's strength and continuity. As the world evolved, so did the role of weapons in the larger social and political landscapes. But no matter how much the tools themselves changed, the core function of weapons remained the same. They were symbols of survival, identity, and power. They were the means by which humans defined their place in the world and marked their accomplishments. In the grand sweep of history, weapons played a pivotal role in the rise and fall of societies. From small tribal units to sprawling civilizations, weapons remained an ever-present part of human life. They were woven into the fabric of not only survival but of culture, identity, and power. The first weapons were much more than simple tools. They were markers of who we were, where we came from, and where we were going. They were part of the story of humanity, shaping us not just as individuals, but as a species connected by the need for defense, expression, and meaning. As we look back on these early weapons, we see more than just tools of survival. We see the essence of what it means to be human, the desire to create, to connect, to protect, and to assert one's identity in an ever-changing world. These weapons, crafted with care and intention, became the symbols of human strength, resilience, and creativity. And through them, we learn not just about our past, but about our future.